The quiet panic. You know that feeling when something's just slightly off about a place, but you can't quite put your finger on what it is? That nagging sensation that makes the hair on your neck stand up for no apparent reason? Well, that's exactly what I felt the moment I stepped into room 9 of the old Riverside Elementary building. And it all started with a clock that never ever stops ticking. I'm talking about a sound so persistent, so unnaturally rhythmic, that it burrows into your brain and refuses to leave. But here's the thing that'll make your skin crawl. When maintenance tried to find the source of that ticking, they discovered something that defied all logic. The clock on the wall had been broken for over 30 years, its hands frozen at 3:17, and yet the ticking continued. Day and night, without pause, without explanation. Now I know what you're thinking. There's got to be a rational explanation, right? Maybe it's pipe settling, or electrical interference, or some other mundane building noise. But I'm about to share with you 3 stories that'll make you question everything you think you know about that room. Stories that involve students, teachers, and even a night janitor who all experienced something so disturbing that it changed their lives forever. By the end of this video, you'll understand why Room 9 has been sealed off for the past 15 years, and why locals refuse to even walk past that section of the building after dark. I've spent months researching this, interviewing witnesses, and digging through old school records that most people never wanted to see the light of day again. What I found will keep you awake tonight. Guaranteed. But first, let me paint you a picture of just how unsettling this place really is. Riverside Elementary was built in 1952, a typical brick structure with long hallways and tall windows that were supposed to let in plenty of natural light. Room 9 was located at the far end of the east wing, isolated from the main flow of student traffic. Even when the school was operational, teachers complained about the room feeling different somehow. Colder than the others despite having the same heating system. Quieter except for that incessant ticking that seemed to echo from the walls themselves. The first incident I want to tell you about happened in 1987. And it involves a 3rd grade teacher named Mrs. Patterson who had been teaching at Riverside for over 20 years. She was known for being unflappable, the kind of educator who could handle anything from playground fights to parent conferences without breaking a sweat. But what happened to her in room 9 during the last week of October changed everything. Mrs. Patterson had volunteered to stay late that Thursday evening to prepare decorations for the school's Halloween party. She'd chosen room 9 because it was spacious and rarely used, perfect for spreading out all the construction paper and craft supplies she needed. The sun had already set and most of the building was empty except for the custodial staff working in other wings. As she arranged orange and black streamers on the desks, she became increasingly aware of the ticking sound. It seemed louder than usual, more pronounced in the quiet building. She glanced up at the old clock on the wall, noting as she always did that its hands remained stuck at 3:17. The school district had been promising to replace it for years, but somehow it never made it onto the maintenance schedule. What started as mild annoyance gradually transformed into something more unsettling. The ticking wasn't just consistent, it was perfectly metronomic, like a heartbeat heartbeat that never varied in rhythm. Mrs. Patterson found herself working in time with the sound, her movements becoming synchronized with each tick. Cut on the tick, paste on the talk, fold on the tick, arrange on the talk. That's when she noticed something that made her hands freeze mid-motion. The shadow cast by the frozen clock hands on the wall was moving. Not the shadow of the actual hands which remained motionless at 3:17, but a separate shadow that crept slowly around the clock face, keeping perfect time with the mysterious ticking. Mrs. Patterson dropped her scissors and moved closer to the wall, squinting in the fluorescent light. The shadow hands were advancing steadily, and as she watched in growing horror, they reached 9:47, the exact time on her wristwatch. But the physical hands of the clock hadn't budged an inch. She stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, watching this impossible shadow clock tick forward while the broken timepiece remained frozen. The ticking grew louder, filling her head until it drowned out her own heartbeat. That's when she heard something else mixed in with the relentless rhythm. A faint whispering that seemed to emanate from the clock itself. The words were indistinct at first, like voices heard through water, but gradually they became clearer. It was children's voices, she realized, reciting numbers in unison. 3:17, 3:17, 3:17, they chanted in time with the ticking, their voices growing more insistent with each repetition. Mrs. Patterson backed away from the wall, her craft supplies forgotten, but the voices followed her. They seemed to come from every direction now, not just the clock. 3:17, 3:17, echoing from the corners of the room, from inside the desks, from the air itself. She grabbed her purse and bolted for the door, but her hand froze on the doorknob. The voices had stopped abruptly, and in the sudden silence she heard something far worse, footsteps in the hallway outside. Small footsteps like children walking in formation, accompanied by that same mechanical ticking. Mrs. Patterson pressed her ear to the door and listened as the footsteps passed by, counting at least a dozen sets of small feet moving in perfect synchronization with the ticking. But that was impossible. The building was empty except for custodial staff, and it was well past 9 o'clock on a school night when the footsteps finally faded down the hallway. She waited another 10 minutes before cracking the door open. The hallway was empty and dark, illuminated only by the red exit signs at either end. She ran to her car without looking back, leaving all her Halloween decorations scattered across the desks in room 9. The next morning, Mrs. Patterson found her supplies exactly as she'd left them, but with one disturbing addition. Written on the blackboard in neat, childish handwriting were the words, "We're still here at 3:17, repeated over and over until they filled the entire surface. When she asked the custodial staff about it, they swore they hadn't been in room 9 the night before. The head janitor even showed her his key log, which tracked every room entry. According to the records, no one had accessed room 9 after Mrs. Patterson left at 9:52 p.m. She never used room 9 again, and within a month she'd requested a transfer to another school. But the strange thing is, she wasn't the first teacher to have an experience like this in that room, and she definitely wouldn't be the last. The second story takes place just 3 years later in 1990 and involves a student named Marcus Chen who was in 4th grade at the time. Marcus was what teachers politely called energetic, the kind of kid who had trouble sitting still and was frequently sent to the hallway for disrupting class. On this particular day in early November, his regular teacher, Mrs. Williams, had reached her limit with his behavior. As punishment, Marcus was sent to room 9 to complete his math worksheet in isolation. It was a common disciplinary measure at Riverside. Problem students were often relegated to the empty classroom to work alone until they could behave appropriately. Mrs. Williams walked him to the room, made sure he had his worksheet and pencil, and told him she'd be back in an hour. Marcus had been in room 9 before for similar timeouts, so he wasn't particularly bothered by the arrangement. He'd noticed the ticking sound during previous visits, but like most kids, he'd simply accepted it as part of the room's character. Old buildings made weird noises. That was just a fact of life. But on this day, something was different. As Marcus sat at one of the student desks working through multiplication problems, he became aware that the ticking was getting louder. Not gradually, but in distinct jumps, as if someone was slowly turning up the volume on a radio. He looked up from his worksheet, pencil hovering over the half-finished problems, and stared at the broken clock. The hands still pointed to 3:17, just as they always had. But now the ticking filled the room like thunder. Each tick seemed to vibrate through the floor, up through his desk and into his bones. Marcus tried to focus on his math, but the numbers on the page began to blur. Not from eye strain, but as if they were actually moving, rearranging themselves while he watched. A 7 became a 3, then a 1. A multiplication sign twisted into something that looked almost like a tiny clock face. That's when he noticed the other desks weren't empty anymore. Children sat at each one, their heads bent over their own worksheets, pencils moving in perfect unison with the ticking. They wore clothes from different eras, some in 1950s dresses and button-up shirts, others in 1960s patterns, still others in outfits from decades Marcus couldn't identify, but they all had one thing in common. They were completely motionless except for their writing hands, which moved mechanically back and forth across their papers. Marcus blinked hard, certain he was seeing things, but when he opened his eyes, the phantom students were still there. He could hear their pencils scratching against paper now, a sound that blended seamlessly with the ticking to create an almost hypnotic rhythm. One of the children, a girl in a blue dress with her hair in pigtails, slowly raised her head and looked directly at Marcus. Her eyes were hollow, empty sockets that seemed to pull light from the room. When she smiled, her mouth opened far too wide, revealing rows of tiny tick marks where her teeth should have been. "Time for your test," she whispered, her voice perfectly synchronized with the clock's rhythm. "Time for your test, time for your test." The other children began raising their heads one by one, each revealing the same hollow eyes and mechanical smile. They chanted in unison now, their voices creating a chorus that made Marcus's head spin. "Time for your test, time for your test, time for your test." Marcus shot up from his desk, his chair clattering backward, but his feet felt rooted to the floor. The ticking had become so loud it was all he could hear, drowning out his own panicked breathing. The phantom children stood as one, their movements jerky and unnatural, like marionettes controlled by an inexperienced puppeteer. They began walking toward him, their footsteps perfectly matching the relentless ticking. Marcus opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The air itself seemed thick and heavy, pressing down on him like a weight. Just as the closest child reached out with fingers that looked more like clock hands than human digits, the door burst open. Mrs. Williams stood in the doorway, her face flushed from hurrying down the hallway. "Marcus, what on earth is all that noise?" she demanded, then stopped short when she saw him standing frozen in the middle of the room, his face white as paper. The phantom children were gone. The desks were empty. The ticking had returned to its normal, barely noticeable volume, but Marcus could still see the faint outlines where they'd been sitting, like after-images burned into his retinas. He never spoke about what he saw that day, but his behavior in school changed dramatically. He became quiet, obedient, almost unnaturally well-behaved. His parents were thrilled by the transformation, but his teachers noticed something troubling. Marcus had developed a compulsive habit of checking his watch every few seconds, and he would often be found staring at clocks with an expression of pure terror. Years later, as an adult, Marcus would tell his therapist that he still heard the ticking sometimes, especially at 3:17 in the afternoon. He'd learned to avoid looking at clocks at that time because he swore he could still see those hollow-eyed children reflected in the glass. But the most disturbing story of all comes from 1993, just 2 years before the school board finally decided to seal Room 9 permanently. It involves the night janitor, a man named Eddie Kowalski who had been working at Riverside for 15 years and thought he'd seen everything the old building could throw at him. Eddie was used to working alone in the empty corridors, mopping floors and emptying trash cans while the rest of the world slept. He'd heard all the stories about Room 9, of course. Whispered conversations between teachers, worried phone calls from parents, and the occasional student who came out of the room looking like they'd seen a ghost. But Eddie was a practical man who didn't put much stock in ghost stories. That changed on a Tuesday night in March, when Eddie noticed that the light in Room 9 was on. That was unusual. The room hadn't been used for regular classes in months, ever since the last teacher assigned to it had requested a permanent transfer after just 2 weeks. Eddie figured someone had simply forgotten to turn off the lights, so he grabbed his keys and headed down the East Wing hallway. As he got closer to Room 9, he could hear the familiar ticking sound, but it seemed different somehow. More urgent, more insistent, like a countdown timer approaching 0. He unlocked the door and stepped inside, reaching for the light switch, when he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Every desk in the room had a worksheet on it, and every worksheet was being filled out by an invisible hand. Pencils moved by themselves, writing answers in neat, identical handwriting while floating 3 inches above the paper. Eddie rubbed his eyes, certain he was hallucinating from too much overtime, but the pencils kept moving. And as he watched in growing horror, he realized they weren't writing math problems or spelling words. They were writing the same phrase over and over again. Eddie Kowalski will join us at 3:17. The ticking grew louder, and Eddie could feel it synchronizing with his heartbeat. His pulse began to match the rhythm exactly, as if the sound was taking control of his body's most basic functions. The pencils wrote faster now, filling page after page with his name and that ominous time. Eddie tried to back out of the room, but the door slammed shut behind him. The broken clock on the wall began to emit a soft, pulsing glow, and for the first time in 30 years, the hands started to move. They crept slowly around the clock face, approaching 3:17 with mechanical precision. As the hands drew closer to their destination, Eddie felt his own movements becoming more mechanical, more synchronized with the ticking. His head turned toward the clock against his will, his eyes fixed on those advancing hands. The invisible pencils wrote faster and faster, the scratching sound building to a crescendo that made his ears ring. When the clock hands finally reached 3:17, everything stopped. The ticking ceased. The pencils dropped to the desks. The room fell into a silence so complete that Eddie could hear his own blood rushing through his veins. Then, in that terrible quiet, he heard children laughing. Not the joyful laughter of kids at play, but something cold and mechanical, perfectly timed like clockwork. The laughter seemed to come from inside the walls themselves, from inside the broken clock, from inside his own head. Eddie found himself walking toward the clock, his feet moving without his permission. As he got closer, he could see that the clock face wasn't just glowing. It was opening, like a door or a window into somewhere else. Inside, he could see a classroom filled with children, all sitting at desks, all writing the same phrase over and over. Eddie Kowalski will join us at 3:17. Just as he reached out to touch the glowing clock face, the spell broke. Eddie snapped back to awareness, stumbled backward, and ran for the door. This time it opened easily, and he burst into the hallway, gasping for air. He quit his job the next morning and never set foot in Riverside Elementary again. But according to his wife, Eddie never fully recovered from that night. He became obsessed with time, checking every clock in their house multiple times a day and growing agitated whenever he heard ticking sounds. On March 15, 1995, exactly 2 years after his experience in Room 9, Eddie Kowalski was found dead in his living room. The official cause of death was a heart attack, but there were some details that never made it into the newspaper. Eddie was found sitting in front of his mantel clock, which had stopped at exactly 3:17. His face wore an expression of absolute terror, and clutched in his hand was a piece of paper covered with the phrase, "Eddie Kowalski joined us at 3:17, written over and over in his own handwriting. The school board sealed Room 9 3 months later, citing structural concerns and ongoing maintenance issues. But the real reason was simpler. They couldn't find anyone willing to work in or near that room anymore. Teachers refused assignments there. Students claimed to be sick whenever they were supposed to use it. And even the maintenance staff drew the line at entering Room 9. Today, Riverside Elementary stands empty, converted into a community center that carefully avoids using the East Wing. Room 9 remains sealed behind a heavy steel door, but locals claim you can still hear the ticking if you press your ear against the metal. Some say it's getting louder, more insistent, as if whatever lives in that room is growing impatient. The broken clock still hangs on the wall inside, its hands frozen at 3:17, marking a moment in time that refuses to pass. And if you believe the stories, if you listen carefully on quiet nights, you can still hear the voices of all those who encountered something beyond explanation in room 9. They're all there now, trapped in that endless moment, waiting for others to join them in a place where time stands still and the ticking never ever stops.